Good evening, everybody. My name's Josephine Taylor from the Wildlife Trust. We're here tonight for the Rutland Water Osprey project, which has been led by George Smith, and the Badger Group, Leicestershire Rutland Badger Group, are hosting it. We're just going to allow a few more moments for some more people to come through, and then we'll make a start. Just bear with us. Yeah, so I think we'll make a start. So I'll just run through some domestic stuff. So throughout the evening, we're pleased to welcome George Smith, the Information Officer at the Leicestershire Rutland Wildlife Trust, and David Duckett, who's the chair of the Leicestershire Rutland Badger Group. So for tonight, if you have any questions, we're using the Q&A for any questions, and some links that will drop into the chat as well, especially for during the AGM. So I'm going to hand you over to David, who will make the introductions.
Okay, thank you, Jo. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Badger Group's February meeting, and tonight we're having our AGM. I think we got 25 people attending. I'm losing track. It's more people coming in, so hopefully they're joined by the actual talk. As Jo said, if anyone doesn't know me, I'm David Duckett, chairman of the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group. I always do a plug for the group if people aren't members. We're always looking for new members. So if anyone's interested, we have our own membership. We're affiliated to the Wildlife Trust, but we have our own membership, and you can join us either by contacting me or going into our website, which is creaking at the moment, but it's badgergroup.org.uk. Jo might put that in the chat line if possible. I just want to update briefly on the badger culling situation in England following a new government who promised would stop culling. I think they're prevaricating a lot at the moment. Badger culling is almost certainly going on at the moment till 2026 at least. And the Labour Party have just announced that there's going to be a strategy refresh review under Sir Charles Godfrey from Oxford University. I think it's Oxford, not Cambridge. He did a review back in 2018, and he's been brought back with his committee. Now, I know from the Badger Trust and indeed other wildlife organisations, they're very worried about this because many of the people in that group are very farming, agriculturally orientated. And I think the Badger Trust will make a big effort to try and change that, with people perhaps signing petitions and campaigning to try and get more environmentalists, wildlife people on board of the committee to get a better review. Okay, I've done my badger issue for the night, so I'm going to move on to tonight's meeting. As I've just said, we're going to have the AGM, which will follow straight after the talk. And the AGM is primarily for Badger Group members, and hopefully we've got a few of you here tonight, but other people are welcome to attend if they wish to. Sadly, it will be fairly dry, I think, but you're welcome to attend. As Jo said, if there's any questions both for the talk and for the AGM, please put them in Q&A rather than chat. So moving on to tonight's talk, I'm very pleased to welcome George Smith, who I've known for a few years. George has been involved at Rutland Water in various capacities for several years. And in the last couple of years, he's been Osprey, or one of the Osprey information officers at Linden, and I'm sure some of you will have met him. He's now working a bit with the Osprey Leadership Foundation, which was founded by Dr. Tim McCreel a few years back. So I'm going to hand you over to George, who's going to tell you some updates in particular of the Rutland Water Osprey project. Over to you, George.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. And hello, everybody. It feels a little bit strange to be doing this behind a screen. So if anything goes tragically wrong, you're going to have to message instead of verbally heckling me this evening. So that's going to be a little bit of a different experience. Thank you for the very warm welcome. As David said, my name's George. I used to be the information officer at the Leicestershire Rutland Wildlife Trust. I did that for 2.5 years. And I am now working with Tim McCrill with the Osprey Leadership Foundation, doing a bit of work with their training and education work at the moment. So what I'm going to talk through this evening, granted there's an awful lot of people here today, you'll have different levels of understanding of Osprey conservation and history in the UK. So I'm going to do a little bit of a background of the history of the Ospreys first, and then we'll talk about Rutland Water. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time to talk about future growth and what we can continue to do moving forward, what the best plan of action is. So I hope I don't need to introduce the ospreys as a species to any of you. They're a fantastic bird of prey, a migratory species. Primarily the birds that we see in the UK are travelling between us and Western Africa. But what makes them even more special, both from a conservation story and then also a public appreciation perspective, is that they have had this huge reintroduction, this huge success, this huge bounce back from essential extinction in the UK. And we also are able to use them as a bit of a figurehead for conservation efforts. They're a very charismatic species. People really love the ospreys. Thousands and thousands of people come down to the various osprey visitor centres throughout the United Kingdom each year to get a glimpse, to get a photograph, and to just be a part of these fantastic birds' journeys between West Africa and Europe. So their migration is key. As I said earlier, the birds that we are seeing here in the UK, if you can follow this map, are primarily travelling between the UK and Western Africa. But they're a cosmopolitan species, so you can find them absolutely anywhere in the world, bar Antarctica. So the North American species, the Carolinensis birds, are heading down to South America. All of our species, the Haliaetus subspecies, are heading between Europe and Asia and those southern points. And then there are two non-migrating species, which are particularly interesting. The Ridgway, which are found in that little patch in the Caribbean, and then also the Cristatus, which are sometimes referred to as eastern ospreys, as a whole different species altogether, and they're found around Australia all year round. But thinking specifically around the history of ospreys in our country, they used to be a really prosperous species. There used to be thousands and thousands of pairs of them flocking over to us each spring to then breed in those spring and summer months. And I mean, if you walk around England now between those spring and summer seasons, you're far less likely to see an osprey than you were back in those times. And unfortunately, the main reason for that is, as it is with most conservation tragedies, it's human intervention, it's human impact. And in short, a lot of the reason for the osprey persecution was because there was a lot of food required to sustain a growing population in the UK. And because as a nation, an island nation, we have a lot of fishing industry, and we're a very Christian nation. Fish suppers are seen as quite a religious meal. Ospreys were persecuted because they're stealing that fish from us, or at least that was the perspective. They're a piscivorous species, so they only eat fish as part of their diet. And while there are certainly some bits of scapegoating throughout history referring to ospreys as taking livestock and things like that, there's very little evidence to suggest that that's ever happened, and scientifically it doesn't really make so much sense for them to be taking that sort of prey. But alas, those reasons really bottled into this decline, this persecution, And by 1847, we were limited to our last breeding pair in the United Kingdom in England, in Somerset, and that was shot. So that led to basically no ospreys in England at that point. And after that, there were about 40 to 50 pairs remaining in Scotland, and they were whittled down over the next 50, 60 years until in 1916 they were considered an extinct breeding population. Now, across the board, that's normally considered to be it for a species, and typically, if you wanted to get something like that back, you'd then have to have a human intervention once more to bring them back into the country. And granted, there was human intervention, but it wasn't immediately necessary. So in 1954, an ornithologist called Desmond Nethersole Thompson was walking through the Scottish Highlands around a place which is very popular now for osprey lovers, a site called Loch Garten, where he stumbled upon something which was completely improbable, an osprey nest with two young being fed on it. Naturally, being an intelligent ornithologist, he knew the risks of publicizing this information, and so he kept it secret, divulging the information only to a couple of select individuals. But unfortunately, that wasn't quite enough. The year after that specific nest was robbed, and it sort of continued to be an issue for a couple of years following, until they got a bit of a volunteering base, until they got a bit more protection around that site. And in 1959, a real visionary conservationist, a gentleman called George Waterston, decided he'd had enough of the secrecy just naturally spreading, and decided to take control of it and publicize the success of this brand new osprey breeding pair. Now, this was a fantastic decision in retrospect, but must have been incredibly, incredibly brave at the time to have put himself out there. This is a picture of a young Roy Dennis and George Waterston, who's on the right here. I think he was at the time the head of the RSPB in Scotland, and so he had quite a lot of persuasion in the matters of what they would do with the ospreys they had up there. But by publicizing it and by inviting people to come and celebrate this bird, it offered that new level of protection, because not only were you having the volunteers taking watch over the nest, you then also had a public appeal for the ospreys to stay there. They were suddenly seen as this commodity, not because of trying to collect their eggs or trying to get a taxidermied osprey above your mantelpiece. They suddenly became this wonderful tourist attraction where people would travel miles and miles to come and see them, much similar to the way in which we see ospreys today. We have visitor centres dotted around the United Kingdom, and they all succeed so well based off of this big drive that the birds bring to them. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, not to get too bogged down in the older history of it, but in 1995, Roy Dennis came into contact with the people working at Rutland Water, and they'd realised that the natural spread of ospreys from Scotland back through into England was going to take hundreds of years for there to be a successful population, just naturally progressing. And so they followed suit some techniques that have been used around Europe and around North America, especially in North America with ospreys, when DDT had caused a lot of issues with those breeding birds, and they were trying to bounce back their populations. And what they took from those two reintroductions was this method of translocation. And between the years of 1996 and 2001, it was agreed that 64 juveniles would be released at Rutland Water, and they were put into these pens here, overlooking the water, so that when they finally fledged, when they finally took those first flights, they'd be imprinting on that land around them, or maybe vice versa, the land would be imprinting onto them. And the hope with this was that when they make that migration down to West Africa or wherever they'd end up, when they eventually came back those few years later, they'd be heading back to Rutland Water, seeking it out as what they consider to be home, such that they would then eventually breed here for themselves and establish a really successful breeding population. And there's not really much room for spoiling the ending of that, really. I'm sure everyone knows, certainly because you're here this evening, about what ended up happening in 2001. Well, in 1999, some of those birds returned. Notably, a pair of those translocated birds from 1997, Zero. I'm going to have to get this right now, because there's a couple of people here who are prepared to correct me very quickly if I get it wrong. Yeah, it was 08 and 03. One of those, 03, going on to become a very famous osprey in the Rutland population, nicknamed Mr. Rutland for what will come to be obvious reasons. But for the first couple of years when they returned as young birds, and it's fairly typical for these young birds to just try and establish themselves, trying to create a nest and try and then attract in female ospreys. And in 2001, after a couple of years of returning to the site, 03, nicknamed Mr. Rutland, was able to attract a metal-ringed female on the 5th of April. And a couple of weeks later, they realised that eggs had been laid on the nest, and then a few weeks later, a single chick hatched from them. Now, that was an incredibly significant moment for the project, because it meant that for the first time in 150 years, so since 1847, we finally had a brand new osprey chick bred and born in England. Now, that's an astonishing, just an astonishing point in that massive battle against that extinction, trying to bring them back, is seeing that first chick. And that first chick then started turning into more and more chicks throughout the years, by the point at which, well, we then have to start looking at installing other nesting perches, so that those other birds that are starting to take interest in the site, be they juveniles that have come from the Rutland sites, or birds who are a bit lazy on the way back to Scotland, who think, oh, it's going to cut out a few miles, I'm going to just stop in beautiful old Rutland. And it meant that this population started to boom. And one of those notable nests, one of those nests that I was talking about earlier, those heavily publicised sites, is Manton Bay, a really beloved site and the home of some really fantastic individual ospreys. And in 2007, a female bird called 5N bred for the first time on the Manton Bay nest, and that was with a male bird called 0897. Now, that was the only year that they ended up breeding on that site, before 5N then moved to what became her regular site, the site ironically referred to as Site N. I don't know if that was by choice or just a happy accident, where she then went on to raise 34 juveniles before not returning in 2023. That was a sad time, but that's a fantastic legacy for one individual bird to have granted, or to have left. And it seems to be that female birds breeding on Manton Bay nest seem to become incredibly successful females. And as I'm sure you all know, Maya, who is the current, well, fingers crossed she'll return this year, but the current resident breeding female at Manton Bay, first stopped in 2009, before pairing with a bird called 5R. And they bred for a couple of years before 5R failed to return in 2014. And then Maya did what all ospreys are designed to do. If their male doesn't return, if their mate doesn't return, then they try and move on. It's so imperative that they are able to continue creating new juvenile ospreys. So she started breeding with a new male that year, 2810, but another really beloved osprey to us now, who I'm sure at the time was seen as a bit of a sod, a bit of a ruffian, came in and destroyed the eggs on that nest and then took over the site. And that bird was 33, who with Maya have now gone on to raise, oh gosh, quite a few fledglings since. I've got charts coming up that will show exactly what that number is, but a significant amount of our population here in Rutland. Now, last year was no different in many ways. 33 and Maya returned at the start of the breeding season, laid 3 eggs, which again is typical for experienced osprey pairs. But there was a couple of bits and pieces that didn't quite go to plan. Maya was quite unwell throughout the start of the season. It meant that 2 of the eggs were unviable. And so we were left with 1 chick, 1 RO, who thankfully, despite all of the odds, despite potentially coming from an infertile egg to then nearly getting pushed out of the nest, that's a whole different story. Despite the odds, ended up fledging. And with him fledging, led to Maya becoming the most successful breeding female at Manton Bay. So I'll leave that up on the screen for a couple of minutes just so that you can read that through. But I think there are 3 points here that are really good to highlight. And the first one being the number of young that she's had is the most that any female osprey in the Rutland area has produced in the history of the project. The annual productivity is referring to how many chicks that she has per year. So an average of 2.5 is a good healthy average, especially when you're expecting ospreys to lay 3 to 4 eggs, or 2 to 3 eggs in their nest. And Maya's laid 4 eggs now on 3 separate occasions, twice fledging all 4 of those birds. And then the final figure there, I think, is really quite astonishing. The percentage of her juveniles that have returned to Manton, or at least from their first migration. Now, typically, we see some absurdly low number between 20% and 30% of juveniles returning. So the fact that it's just grazing below 40%, yes, there's a lot of chance with that. There's an awful lot of variability with the predation that they experience on the way on their migration, with the weather events that they see. But all of that can be deterred, at least in part, by how well those juveniles are raised. And it's clear from looking at these Manton Bay juveniles, like 1 RO, for instance, this year, when he left, was so big that I think he looked quite a lot like a female osprey, quite a chubby chap. And that's by no means an insult to ospreys. In fact, I'm sure that if he was able to understand me, he'd take great pride in being referred to as overweight, because it means that he's got that extra energy to head off on migration with, and it much greatens his chance of coming back those years later. It's an awfully long distance that they have to travel, thousands of kilometers. And at this point, when they leave, the juveniles haven't fished for themselves yet. So that adds another element of difficulty, that they're having to pick up these new, incredibly difficult skills on the go. And then I think this graph also quite nicely highlights that growth, not just at Manton Bay, but across the board with Rutland Water. So last year was another really brilliant year with 12 nesting sites for the project, and a record 25 juveniles fledging there. But I think what's more important than just looking at the records is this steady growth, and looking as the population is gradually increasing over time. I think there was a lot of conversation, certainly last year and the year before, talking about, oh, it's looking like it's starting to become stagnant, but we also had lost quite a lot of long-term breeding birds at that point. So I think there is still room for a few more osprey nests before Rutlanders hit capacity. And hopefully these numbers keep growing and we keep seeing that spread around the area. We keep seeing more and more of those fantastic juveniles returning back to, well, Rutland preferably, but anywhere in the UK is going to massively benefit conservation efforts. Now, it's not just Rutland that the Rutland birds have an impact on. There are also sites all across the United Kingdom which have massively benefited from the Rutland Osprey project. I have pictured here a couple of the breeding birds. I think it's Tellen from the Abu Dhabi Osprey project. And this is a breeding female in Abu Dhabi that was born on the Manton Bay nest. So it's one of Maya's offspring and has gone on to be, I think, one of the most successful breeding birds in that region of Wales. And we see that in other areas as well. CJ7, while not a juvenile that came from Manton Bay, was a Rutland bird originally that paired up with a resident male at Poole Harbour. And last year, I thought I'd left the image in, but they succeeded in having 4 juveniles on a very, I think it's maybe 2 or 3 years after they'd started breeding together, which isn't a very long period of time, certainly, for them to be having such a successful clutch and bringing it to all 4 of those birds fledging is a fantastic achievement. Really fantastic, especially for Poole Harbour, where they only have the one nest down there. And again, it's easy to look at those UK sites and consider those to be the important ones, but we also have Rutland birds that have been found all across Europe. And I mean, while there are lots and lots of Scottish pairs now, we still have a couple of Rutland birds making their way all the way up there, apparently much preferring the Highlands and the more densely forested areas to quite. I mean, I'm not going to degrade Rutland in what I say about it, but there's certainly far less. Far fewer trees than there are up there. I thought that this would be interesting just to show for the year. So there were 25 juveniles ringed this year on Rutland water sites. So as I said earlier, this is a new record. I think there's been 24 a couple of times in the past, but this is a fantastic number of juveniles. And if you go through those weights on them, bar poor little 3RO at site 0, at site O, a lot of those weights are very, very healthy, with the females being closing in on that 2 kilogram size and the males sort of being quite close to the 1.5 kilogram. That's a very good weight for those young ospreys to be prior to them leaving on migration. And I know that there's a couple of people here at the moment who I don't know if this has been handed out just yet, so I'll leave it on the screen just for a second more to give people an opportunity to read through that, to take a screenshot of it, but we'll leave it there for the time being. But the other thing to highlight from that as well is it's further cementing what we were saying earlier about it's typical for these ospreys to be laying 2 or 3 eggs. That's what the majority of those sites have produced, and Manton Bay, well, being one of the exceptions, but that's due to extreme circumstance this year. And so that leads us on to this chart. So it's, I think the last time this was showed, people complained that it was incomplete and wasn't showing all the way up to 2024, but there's good reason for that. So this chart here is displaying the number of juveniles, their return rate from certain years. So the birds from 2023 and 2024, when those ospreys go on their first migration down to West Africa or to Southern Europe, wherever they're ending up, they'll typically spend 2 to 3 years down there before making their way back up to the UK. So what we're looking at here is those birds that we know have returned. The first couple of columns are looking at the breeding statistics for that year. And then at the end, it's demonstrating how many of those birds are making it back. And I think what's quite interesting with this to look at is it fluctuates, and it doesn't seem to really be corresponding with too much that you're seeing. It doesn't seem to be settling as a certain figure, or averaging out at something as the population grows. You'd maybe expect it to be, with a larger population size, for it to be becoming more and more similar as time goes on. But I think this highlights one of the parts of that osprey migration which is so treacherous, which is so unforgiving and unpredictable, and that's the weather. If at some of these years, especially where you have those extremely low percentage return rates, years where there have been huge amounts of storm and huge amount of difficulty for these birds, especially on crossing larger bodies of water. And especially when you factor in those easterly winds pushing them out into the open ocean, a lot of those juveniles aren't capable, or pretty much none of those juveniles are capable of readjusting that course. And it leads to an awful lot of them not making it back. I think this brings it into perspective, really, how important it is that we have such a large population around Rutland and we get as many juveniles consistently leaving as possible. Because even with a year 2018, for example, where 14 juveniles ended up leaving, only one of those returned. And that's quite a shocking, it's quite a hard figure to really comprehend. Now, a couple of those birds in particular returned this year, notably for me from 2022, one of which was 1H1, and she holds a very special place in my heart because she was one of the first ospreys I ever monitored at Manton Bay. And so I have distinct memories of 1H1 sort of being quite a bully on that nest, and leaving incredibly late with a huge, well, she was also very, very well fed and left with, I think, as much, with as much going for her as she possibly could have, with the way that Myron 33 had been feeding her. And thankfully, we did then see her this year. Firstly, she was sighted on a nest site in Germany, and then was further seen in Poole Harbour, where it looks like she may well be settling. And hopefully, in the next couple of years, we may have some information about her finally having a nest of her own and producing that next generation of ospreys. This is another graph just showing that those percentage return rates from a slightly different perspective. And again, it varies so drastically over sort of a 3-year period, and that seems fairly consistent. But there are some years where there are incredibly low return rates, as I was just saying, and that it really hammers home the fact that you could have 20 ospreys leave, 25 this past year in our case, and we could end up with maybe just 3 or 4 of those returning, if that. And that, I think that really is something that makes it incredibly, even though we're seeing these huge numbers of juveniles, or like this constantly increasing productivity of the nesting sites, it still hammers home that it's important to keep protecting it and keep making sure that it's sustainable. And one of those things beyond the weather, which is going to become more of an issue in time to come, is human impact. And I'm not meaning here in the UK. I think it's very easy to think about osprey conservation from a British perspective. They're a bird that we are used to seeing seasonally, and we sort of associate them with home. But they do migrate from and to West Africa. And these are areas of very poor countries where a lot of their conservation efforts are non-existent or very, very underfunded. I was really privileged and very, very lucky to be given the opportunity to head to the Gambia with my work with the Osprey Leadership Foundation last week. And it's really eye-opening to a lot of those conservation efforts, but also quite quite shocking and quite worrying as to how much is continuing to get worse down there. And what's pictured here at the moment is a sort of a tip essentially associated with a fish factory. Now, these fish factories didn't exist 5-10 years ago. These are created by the Chinese for pure profit because it's so cheap to create those factories in Western Africa. And they're employing Senegalese fishermen to go out into these boats and catch a lot of these fish. Now, they're not going to deplete the waters. Well, they may well do, but that's not the immediate issue. But they're not going to stop the ospreys from being able to eat down in West Africa. In fact, they're making it much easier. These massive nets that they're casting out into the waters are catching the fish and they're being left. They're not being supervised. These fishermen are laying these massive nets out in the water and then sailing away, having a bit of lunch and then coming back to obtain the catch. Now, this is having a couple of different effects on those local ospreys. It means that when those fish are caught in those nets, they're essentially free game for the birds to go down and catch them. But with nets comes that risk of them getting tangled. And while having conversations with locals about the ospreys fishing from those nets, that they haven't ever seen a bird get tangled in them. While I was on the beaches watching them, we saw a bird come down and grab the nets and then fly away, just releasing them before setting off. And that really is troubling. And I think it's more troubling because it's not something that I personally would have considered from a conservation, certainly of ospreys. Like as I said, it's very easy to think about the stuff that's on your doorstep, but these birds spend half of their lives down in Western Africa, and it's incredibly important that these environments are kept pristine. And it's not just ospreys. As I said at the beginning of the talk, they're a fantastic species to use as a figurehead for conservation, to use to start these conversations about conservation. But there are other species which are a massive threat based off of mass habitat decline in these countries. Nightingales, for instance, we're seeing fewer and fewer of those across the UK, and a lot of what you read about it is based on that UK habitat decline. And there is certainly a truth to that. But when you also then consider that they're heading to these countries during those winter months and they're running out of places to then stay, to then overwinter, what happens when all of those habitats are gone? What happens when these waters are so polluted, not necessarily with pollutants, but in terms of loss of ecosystem? What happens to the ospreys? What's going to happen to our nightingales? What's going to happen to our willow warblers and our chiffchaffs and all of these fantastic species we've become so we really adore and we love, these fantastic, beautiful birds, and they're all at this huge threat because these countries are desperate. They need the money that all of this infrastructure brings in, and there isn't that much money at the moment with conservation. And this, I feel, is a bit of a damper on the mood, but this is where organisations like the Osprey Leadership Foundation come in. And one of the things that I was doing while in West Africa, whilst going to a couple of local schools, and was having these school groups come and learn about the fantastic ospreys. And what's wonderful about this, as we sort of highlight and we have our groups here in the UK, is it's cementing this idea that these fantastic birds are something to be cherished, are something that these kids are going to want to grow up to protect, because it's not really something where, unless we start to finance it directly through tourism, which is certainly an option, it's not something that we're going to be able to directly influence from the UK. And if these kids grow up to by chance come into a position of power, then they may well think back to these times when they were growing up, learning about the birds, but also learning through wildlife as well, learning to do basic maths by counting birds on the beach line, learning about geography by seeing where these birds are going. like if that understanding and that love for the natural world can be put back into the younger generations, both in Western Africa, but also here back home in the UK, then that's going to set in motion an awful lot more chance that we're going to be all right, and we're going to be seeing these birds for a lot longer, certainly than if we start to ignore them, and certainly if we start to ignore talking about them with our younger people. And I think that's a really nice place to be ending it on. I think it rounds off what's so important about the conservation movement. It's not just about putting a bunch of nests up in Rutland. I mean, that's done fantastic. It's had a fantastic effect to bolster the local population and to grow it over the last 20 years. 25 years coming up to now. But it's then starting to move on to the future where there's only so many nesting perches or so much you can do here in the UK before you start to then wonder why, like 20, 30 years later, these populations are then starting to dwindle again. And I think that turning our heads to these countries where these birds are going, something which is probably not a conscious thought with us every day, is the next step. And it's trying to then bring that into the story that we tell every year when we get really excited about these brilliant birds coming back in March or April. And I hope that that's given you a bit to think about. I hope that that's been interesting, certainly from looking at the Rutland populations, but also then I hope you've enjoyed maybe a slightly different perspective on a talk that I've done quite a few times. It's been nice to put in those experiences that I've only recently had, and putting a lot of my own perspectives into context. So thank you all very, very much for having me. And I don't know if there's any time for questions. David or Joe will let me know shortly, I'm sure.
Well, I'm coming in then, George, if that's your final word on the talk. Thank you very much for an excellent overview. There's certainly one question in the questions, and I've got a few for you. Surprise, surprise. So Sam says, do low return rates indicate higher mortality or dispersal? I think to some degree you've covered that, but if you'd like to address that, please.
So I think, I mean, what was the question? Sorry, David. Do lower return rates?
Low return rates indicate higher mortality or dispersal?
Right. So those return rates are referring to any of those birds turning up anywhere after that immediate migration. So it's the birds that don't make it back. When there's a lower percentage, it's because more of those birds have died on that migration. So it doesn't matter where they end up, so long as they pop back north of Africa a couple of years after they've fledged, then that will count as a returning bird. So it's not necessarily just about returning to the UK. It's about just making it back and then attempting to, not necessarily, but hopefully then attempting to breed somewhere.
Okay, well, to expand on that, if there aren't any other questions coming through yet, with regard to the return rates that you showed, and Maya in particular, you gave details. The return rates you gave were based on birds coming back to Rutland Water area or anywhere in Britain, Europe?
Yeah, again, so it's not just the Rutland Water area. So this is referring to absolutely anywhere in Britain or Europe that they
then those return rates are determined purely by rings on birds being observed.
Yeah, and so the return rates are definitely going to be lower than the actual figures. They're beforehand, and it still occurs with some projects around the country, that some birds are satellite tagged, and so you have quite a a close relationship with their migration. You understand exactly where they are. But no, certainly with all of the Rutland birds now, all of that information regarding return rates is based off of citizen science. So people taking photographs of the Darvik rings on their legs and then submitting that data to then say that they've seen them. So that I'm sure that there are a bunch of these birds, certainly. I mean, they're covering a vast amount of area potentially for their breeding grounds. So it is entirely possible. In fact, I'd say it's impossible that there aren't a few birds that haven't been discovered that are missing from this chart. But I think certainly from a UK breeding perspective, definitely south of Scotland, the birds that we know are back in those areas, there are probably going to be very few surprises there. A lot of that area is very well monitored, and certainly the British public are very, very keen and passionate about going out and looking for the ospreys year on year. And so I don't think there's going to be that much room for those birds not being identified when they come back. Mainly birds around Europe that sort of fly under the radar and end up breeding in slightly less well-known areas.
Okay, thank you. And there's still no other questions, so I'm carrying on. What is the longest time that you've recorded between a bird leaving, say, Rutland Water and returning? What is the longest gap in terms of years?
I don't know what the longest recorded will be. The longest that I know about is a juvenile that I can't recall which ring number it was, but that was, I think it was 4 years before that one was seen after they left on their first migration. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's stayed in Africa for those 4 years. It could well have made its way back on the second or third year after fledging. Or after that first migration, but it's just been under-recorded. But I know that there have been at least a couple where like 3 or 4 years tends to be the limit to them wanting to stay down in Africa.
Okay, thank you. And then coming back completely differently to the spread of birds in the Rutland Water cohort.
Sure.
12 nests this year, 11 I think successful, wasn't it? These birds were centred on Rutland Water, the nature reserve. What is the radius that Rutland Water area now covers?
Crikey. So there are, I think, you see, this is one of those other parts where it's really quite lovely for me that I don't really know. There are a select handful of people who know the locations of all of the nests in the area and all of the ones that are covered. But of the ones I know, there are a few around Rutland Water in close proximity. But to be honest, I can't answer that without just blatantly guessing. I know that there are a few quite a long distance away, maybe even outside of the boundaries of Leicestershire and Rutland that are monitored as part of this group. But beyond that, I wouldn't be able to answer without blatantly fibbing about my own understanding.
Don't bother to guess, but it's quite a way. And as you said, birds from Rutland Water have ended up at Poole Harbour, ended up at Wales in the Welsh group. Surely this is what's going to happen with these reintroductions and natural introductions or a spread, that all these birds will gradually spread out and hopefully across the country, or countries, England, Wales and Scotland. So you'll get a further spread of ospreys without any reintroductions. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that's the end. That's the hope, isn't it, really? That there's only really so many reintroductions you want to do. Like, if you've already got sites in these strategically positioned points, like Poole Harbour, Rutland, Wales, sort of Cumbria area.
Is there not one proposed for East Anglia, or have I got that wrong?
I know that there were plans for it, but I don't know what what's going ahead with that at the moment.
I have a feeling bird flu put a stop to it when it was going to go ahead.
Yeah, quite possibly. But I think what's really nice about the last couple of years is we're starting to see more nests popping up in areas where there haven't been these reintroduction programs. So there was a nest in the West Midlands where there was a bird from North Wales and a bird from Rutland that have paired together there completely naturally. And by naturally, I mean without any nest perch or without any reintroduction to that specific area. And I think once the Poole Harbour population is established, maybe with a few more juveniles being translocated down there, then you will start to see these gaps naturally filling. And then, I mean, quite similar to the way that sort of red kite reintroduction has sort of went through, we're going to start seeing them as more and more of a common bird wherever you go in the UK. Granted, still not seeing red kites everywhere you go in the UK, but I think you catch my drift.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think there are any more questions, so it's up to me now to thank you very much, George, for an excellent overview. Sorry, something's come up. Just check if that's a new question. It's coming, what is it? It's coming on chat. George, have a look at this page, BTO ringing recovery summaries, public data search for Osprey. It looks like a 2003 Rutland hatched bird was possibly seen in Scotland in 2008. Tim is aware, but he hadn't seen this sighting before. So that's in the chat for you to have a look at. It's not a question to answer now.
I'll look that up and have a look. Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm saying thank you very much, George, for an excellent overview and an update, because our Badger Group have not looked at ospreys through your group for 15 years, I think. So it's really important. Hopefully, those who have never seen ospreys at Rutland Water can get down this spring, summer, assuming the birds return, and they should be back within about 12th, 13th of March, if we're lucky, the early birds. So do make a big effort. So if we can all thank George in a standard way, I'll clap on behalf of all of you. Thank you very much. And we will then proceed straight to the AGM. So anybody who doesn't wish to stay for the AGM, you can go off and get your drinks, your cup of tea. Although Josephine Taylor wants to say something on behalf of the Trust before you sign off. Jo, over to you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, George. I really enjoyed that. As always, I've seen it in person as well, so I've seen the presentation before, but it's always really good to see it. And big question: do we know if May is going to return this year for the webcam? So for those that are aware of the webcam, keep your eyes peeled, and we're crossing our fingers that she'll come back. But she's a bit of an old bird now, isn't she? So we don't know what's going to happen there, but we'll wait and see. So so we've put the night on for free tonight. So if you are willing and able to make a donation to the trust, that'd be great. I'll put something in the chat in a moment. And I want to thank you everybody for attending. It's great to see you all.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, George. So as I say, we'll now say goodbye to you. For those who are going to stay, we'll move on to the AGM.
Do you want to have a bit of a comfort break for a few minutes, or do you want to just go straight in?
I think as we finished fairly quickly, we've only been going for about 55 minutes, and hopefully I intend to expedite this. I think rather than have the break, we'll go straight into it. Hopefully people can hang on there. So I think Jo, with her magic, is probably going to allow you guys, if you wish, to show yourself facially and be able to talk. But please keep muted whilst the meeting's going on. You can ask questions if you wish at a certain stage. Okay.
I'm going to stop recording as well, so don't be afraid
Okay.
to show yourselves.
Well,
But
whilst you do that, I'll just talk about the format